Before we start today's episode, we would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're recording today, the Gadigal people, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Hi, I'm Hannah.
And I'm Sarah.
Welcome to Big Talk.
Big Talk deep dives into the big news stories that you've heard of, but you don't know all the serious and salacious details about.
We revisit the most shocking headlines of the past that have shaped the world we know today.
And in this episode, we are looking at the Salem witch trials.
Everyone's going to be going off about this.
This guy came to me randomly a few weeks ago, and I was like, that's something that I hear all the time and actually don't know a lot about, which kind of is the definition of Big Talk, but I know it's kind of random because it's not really recent history at all, actually.
No, it's not.
This is for the history nerds.
This is.
But it is very relevant. So I'm really excited to do it. And then we put it on the stories. I was like, is this too weird to do, or would people be excited by this? I've never had such a reaction. Like, people were so excited.
Yes.
So I was like, great. Actually, the only thing that got a bigger reaction is when in one of the more recent Big Small Talk episodes, I mentioned a little princess. Oh. Did you see the inbox after that?
I did.
Hundreds.
And I actually had people in the street last week come to me and say, tell Sarah, 3 people last week, tell Sarah that I have seen Little Princess and it defined my childhood too. So I'm letting you formally know now.
I had so many people message, even on my personal, to be like, you probably remember it because the main character's name was Sarah. And I go, that is correct.
Thank you for pointing that out. Thank you for acknowledging me.
I feel seen. Anyway, should we get into the pitch?
Let's do the pitch. So as we said, this is kind of a random one. This is more a history episode than a news headline, but it's our podcast, and actually we're pitching to you that we can do what we want.
So if you have an issue,
send it to the inbox. Why don't you send it to the inbox and that'll get swiftly read.
I genuinely think that the witch trials are fascinating because they are true stories, and also by looking at them we see like they are fueled by like xenophobia, religious extremism, social tensions. And not only that, but we can look at why the witch hunt and the term witch hunt continues to sort of beguile popular imagination 300 years later. Like, it's in TV shows, American Horror Story, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Bewitched, Nicole Kidman version I used to love as a kid, just a little side, Vampire Diaries, but also on TikTok. Like, witchcraft is trending. Tutorials on how to be witchy or how to tap into like black cat energy. Not to mention recently also TikTok stars giving shout outs to the use of Etsy witches as well.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean. This is propaganda and media at its best, actually, over the course of time. Like, this is hundreds and hundreds of years of different kinds of angles and coverage that have given a different branding to witches. So I think it's still relevant as a modern day story to revisit, not only in pop culture, but to examine the political parallels.
Also, the witch trials, you know, they were global. They lasted decades, from Iceland, where it was mostly men being persecuted, to Pendlebrook in the UK, where a 9-year-old put her entire family to death by accusing them of being witches.
Oh my God.
But in this episode, we're actually going to focus our attention on the most famous trial in popular culture, which is the Salem witch trials.
And we're going to look at what was happening in Salem at that time. The Puritans, folk magic, the afflicted girls, who was accused and why they did it. Then in part 2, we'll look at the trials themselves, other global examples, and the pop culture witchy resurgence.
Let's get into it.
Do you want to first explain maybe where the term witches even comes from?
Absolutely, I can take you on a history detour on this. From my understanding, and I think the thing about this I want to say at the top as well is I had a very fun time watching lots of random documentaries for this in the background, and a lot of like random BBC stuff that I found on YouTube.
You can justify anything.
Oh my God. I've gone a lot of mainly BBC stuff and different stuff, but like it was sort of hard. There was like slightly different accounts of everything. So if you're listening to this and you're like, that's not what I think, like, yeah, it's also probably fair what you've read as well. Like, anyway, witches dates back really before organized religion or even heads of state existed in a European sense. And witches weren't originally known as monsters or tricksters, but they were known as wise ones. They were the healers, they were the midwives, they were the seers. And among the early Anglo-Saxons, they were called, I think it's WICCE. I think it's Wicca?
Because then it's Wicca with CCA for men, isn't it?
Yes. So it must be
Wicca?
Yeah.
Wiki.
Yeah, anyway. And Wicca for men, which carried the meaning of one who bends or shapes reality. So originally, being that wasn't an insult. It meant that you had a connection to forces that people just didn't understand. Then things changed with the rise of Christianity in Europe. Suddenly, anything that didn't come from the church was suspect. So folk healers, astrologers, midwives, many of them, of course, who were women, were now seen as dangerous. And that sort of like wise was shifted to wicked. Obviously, like folk magic, herbal medicine didn't like completely die when the church took power. Its teachings were still passed on, but it wasn't exactly shown off or encouraged. But the witch hysteria, if we're looking at that now directly, really took hold in Europe in the mid 1400s when many of the like accused witches started to confess to using folk magic still. To be fair, though, a lot of those confessions were because they were being tortured. But there are two mentions in the Bible that warned against divination. And so that's really what the church used to condemn witches. But between the years of like 1500 to 1660, up to 80,000 suspected witches were put to death.
In Europe alone?
In Europe alone. Fun fact, Germany had the highest rates. Ireland the lowest, 80% of them women.
And looking first at Europe, we really do have a certain book to blame for the way it got so out of control. It was the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, a novel written by two well-respected German Dominicans in 1486. And it was translated as The Hammer of Witches. Essentially, it was a how-to guide to identify, hunt, and interrogate witches. And for more than a century, the book sold more copies of any other book in Europe except the Bible.
And isn't that telling?
Isn't that really something? We also really have this book to thank for the innate misogyny of the witch trials because it claimed that women were morally and intellectually weaker, more emotional and more sexual. Not just that they were more likely to be healers and a lot of that magic was passed through women. It also majorly advocated for torture. Nice. What the fuck? Despite people claiming to be innocent, and then gave a step-by-step guide on how to conduct the trials in the most fucked, unfair way possible. Essentially, everyone is guilty and must confess and then publicly repent.
We will get more into the actual trials because they are ridiculous, but that'll be more part 2. Anyway.
Can you take us through why the church feared healers so much?
Because, essentially, many healing practices had roots in pre-Christian or like pagan traditions, right? So including, as we said, like charms, astrology. And that wasn't great for the Christian movement and sort of church's power because that was seen as a threat to the church's spirituality. Kind of sounding a bit jealous.
Yeah, hive mindset, yeah.
But eventually the witch hysteria began to calm down in Europe, but only to then ramp up again in a new place, the New World, what would be known as America. So I want to have a look at first what was sort of brewing in Salem, Massachusetts that gave way to the witch hysteria. So as we know, the idea of evil witches were sort of came across with the English settlers to the US. The settlers were actually Puritans.
Can you then explain what Puritans are?
Yeah, so Puritans were a group of English Protestants who believed the Church of England was still too much like the Catholic Church. So they wanted to purify it and like streamline it and go off the very direct teachings of the Bible. They were very literal. So many of them were having a pretty hard time in England for being seen as too extreme. So they moved to New England. But to be clear, they also weren't the first American settlers. Like, obviously, Native Americans had been there for thousands of years. Spanish settlers, 1500s. Jamestown was the first English settlement in 1607. That's actually interesting because that was more for economic opportunities, not religious freedom, like the Puritans later on. Also to note, the Puritans are slightly different to the Pilgrims. Like when we hear like Thanksgiving, stuff like that, you hear about the Pilgrims. Pilgrims came on the Mayflower and they wanted to completely separate from the Church of England that they believed was completely beyond reform. Whereas Puritans wanted to stay in the church but purify and reform it.
That makes, yeah.
Yeah.
So in 1630, when the Puritans first settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony, their leader, John Winthrop, gave this famous speech calling their new home a city upon a hill. And what he meant was that this colony would be a shining example of a godly society. And this is one where church and government were completely intertwined, completely connected, completely overlapping.
How awful.
Awful. But also, like, just think back, one of the fundamentals of a democracy is the separation of church and state, right? As time goes on, Massachusetts changes. It evolves. More and more people move into the Salem area. Quakers, who are like a different religious denomination.
Slightly, I
Remember
think.
from Fleabag? She goes to the Quaker meeting.
Yes.
I like referencing that. And also there's other Christian groups. And so the region gradually becomes more religiously diverse. Puritans are not happy about this. This challenges the very essence, right? By the 1690s, these strict, God-fearing Puritans made up a smaller part of the population than ever before. They're now the conservatives.
Yeah.
Really, they're seen
They're
as
the
the
Conservative
conservatives.
Party.
Yeah. But still, they had this massive impact on culture and society in Salem, and they pushed these ideals strongly. It was also, shock horror, male-dominated. One of the core beliefs that really sticks around through this, though, is the idea of providence. And that is that everything that happened, good or bad, was part of God's plan. And that exists throughout a lot of Christianity.
Yeah.
This idea that like suffering is inherent and anything that happens, it's just in God's plan. We need to believe in him and trust him.
Yeah.
Whether it was a storm, a deadly disease, the success or failure of a settlement, it's all God's will and it needs to be trusted and believed in no matter what. So this is just this battlefield back then between God and Satan, and that this idea that Satan was always trying to corrupt the elect, God's chosen people.
God, it's so interesting.
It is. So again, if something terrible happens, well, Satan is to blame, but the Puritans also believe the devil could work through people. This is where witches come in. The witches are the devil acting in a person form, right? They're wreaking havoc and they are the devil personified.
Because any magic seen outside of the church or not known by the church, well, it can't be God.
No, but let's understand that in a society where this is like the only stimulus they have and the teachings, this is going to invoke one of the most powerful emotions. There's fear and there's paranoia. And that is just a constant thrumming of paranoia in the background at all times that the devil is working among them.
And really that idea of like providence gave them an pretty obvious reason to blame the devil for groups of people that they might have found suspicious and had been affected by the devil if there was ever like a natural or spiritual disaster. And this is important because Salem had just endured a terrible winter, many terrible winters. It was glooming, it was raining, nothing could grow there, right? And really that was their problem ever since they colonized that area. It wasn't an easy existence. It was these long, hard days as farmers. It was a very isolated life. But that difficult climate and poor crops also meant people assumed that God was mad at them. Also, for context, the people of Massachusetts were still dealing with the trauma of like decades of violence at this time, from what I understand. There was this war called the King Philip's War, which had technically ended years prior, but the bloodshed hadn't properly stopped yet, especially on the northern edges of the colony. It's always funny to me when I hear this in history, like when people don't know the fighting like has stopped and then it continues.
And
it's
the
like,
comms.
the comms doesn't get to them yet. Isn't that crazy?
There's not a group chat. It's over. Go home.
But actually what that war was this desperate effort by the Native American tribes to push back against this constant expansion of English settlers.
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly, the Native Americans fighting to keep the land that was theirs and had been for thousands of years was also branded as the devil's work by Puritans.
Propaganda.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Scapegoat.
Yep.
Mainly because they obviously weren't Christian, obviously. So the Puritans saw their colonization as them carrying out a holy mission, opposing the devil, right? On top of that, the colony's leadership wasn't doing a great job at protecting its borders. And in a society where people believed everything happened for a reason, especially reasons tied to divine approval or punishment, many likely saw this ongoing violence then as a sign that God was also displeased with them.
Yeah, but also then add to this perfect storm of what was happening in Salem at the time, a recent smallpox outbreak, which was devastating families. It's also worth mentioning to paint this picture fully is that Puritans also very much believed in sin. Sinners go to hell. So they believed in original sin as well. And original sin is this theological concept mainly found in Christianity that explains why human beings are seen as inherently flawed or inclined towards sin from birth. Very much thanks to the whole Adam and Eve drama. Yeah. So, and let's call it a drama. You know, like,
I wrote these notes because I was like, obviously original sin comes from the whole idea that Eve bit the apple.
Yeah, and so we are all like, the idea is we're all born with sin.
Yeah, because we're all
present.
descendants of Eve.
Yes. And
That makes sense.
it would be the woman, wouldn't it, with the apple? She was hungry.
Well, that's also why. Like, it's like that's why witches were most likely to be women, and they had the magic and whatever, because we are the Eve
We're
descendants.
tainted.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, original sin is this belief that if you did give in and sin or even just tell a lie, one-way ticket to hell. Remember that, because that helps make sense of why the witch trials got so out of hand.
Okay, finally, let's get to the first accusations and the inspiration for the famous play The Crucible. Now, have you seen that?
No.
Really?
You would have. I feel like there's always diversions in our curriculum, what we were taught at different areas, and I'm always like, yes, you would have seen that. I have no fucking idea. You are very historically inclined.
Well, my mum was a history teacher and an English teacher.
Really?
Mhm.
I
Did
did
you know
not
that about
know
Lizzie?
that.
Yeah.
This makes sense because you always have the fact. You always have the historical fact.
Okay. I loved the History Channel as a kid. Some of these witches documentaries I was watching, I was like, oh, I remember this one. My mum let us watch two things, South Park and the History Channel.
Well, oh my God, you should post this for our listeners, what you found in your diary.
Oh my God, yes, I know.
I can't believe we get to bring this up. I was waiting to be able to bring this up.
Oh my God. My dream as a kid was to be a History Channel host.
You found it in a diary from when you were 10 or 11.
Where I'd written what I want to be when I grow up as a History Channel host. Because like I'd watch all these docos all the time and they'd be like outside the pyramids of Egypt. And I'd be like, that is the coolest job in the world. And then I was like pitching stuff to Hannah and she goes, I think you just want to be a History Channel host.
Sarah's pitching like very specific career ideas for us and like professional development for the next few years. And I literally sat there and I was like, hey, you could do anything you want to be, anything you want to be. Now, you want to be a History Channel presenter.
No,
and then Sarah was like, wait, let me show you something.
I think it's because right now I'm going down a Louis Theroux.
Oh, yes.
Absolute
Don't
rabbit
we
hole.
all?
Don't we all? Anywho, the play The Crucible was I was also a drama freak. So this was my favourite intersection. Was a play exactly about the Salem witch trials. So anyway, it doesn't really matter if you haven't seen it, but it is centred on Miss Abigail Williams and her cousin Elizabeth Parris. Now, I think it's very important to note at the very top of this, Abigail is 11 years old. Betty is 9. They are children. Mm-hmm. They are children that started this whole thing. Now, knowing what we know about the Puritans, you will be shocked to learn that Elizabeth, the daughter, and Abigail, the niece of Reverend Samuel Parris, he was the religious figure of the town. Huge deal. I don't actually know if Abigail was his actual niece. I think that was also just like a general term for younger female relatives who her parents were, and her relationship with Reverend Parris is actually unknown, but whatever, moving on.
Whatever.
Also, Reverend Parris, relatively new to the town at this time, I believe. He was sort of coming in to save it, restore it, purify it. In it, like the conservative ways had been lost and the town was feeling like it was diversifying a little too much. Is this all sounding a little familiar?
Yes. Yes.
Make Salem great again. Also in that same household was 2 slaves. There was Tituba and John Indian. Now, Tituba might ring a bell because she does appear quite a few times in popular culture, specifically in American Horror Story.
Coven season I've watched 3 times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the best season, I would say.
It is the best season. It's different.
We don't know a lot about Tituba's background, but she was a woman of colour. Most reported from what I've seen was she was from the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Now, it all started when these small girls decided to experiment with a little bit of folklore themselves. And it was very harmless. Like, it was kind of like, I'm trying to think like little kids playing games like this. Like, it's kind of like, have you ever done like Bloody Mary in the mirror 3 times? Mm-hmm. It's like giving that energy to sleep over.
Yeah, Ouija board sort of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Again, this is really bad in the Reverend households though. Like, again, with everything we've just learned about religion, like it is pretty wild that they were experimenting even at all. But they were experimenting with a fortune-telling technique known as Venus glass, which is where you drop an egg whites into a glass of water and interpreted the sort of shapes that appeared in an attempt to learn more about their future husbands. Girls have stayed the same. So relatable. Also, like, have you ever done that? Like, have you ever got witchy with stuff?
No, my friends like to, and I find it frightening.
You don't have a witchy inclination?
I don't. I personally, and it's ironic because I told my partner the other day that we were doing this for the big talk, and he said, he's a lawyer, and he said, you know what? And you would have been put on trial and burnt at the stake, and you know what? I would have been one of the deciders. And I thought, isn't that so beautiful? In another life, he actually tortured and killed me. But in this life, we're both progressive.
Jail!
Thank God!
I think the true witches of the time, they weren't known.
No, but sorry, going back to the question, I don't have a witchy inclination, even though
Really?
my point there was I think I would have been burnt at the stake, and I proudly would have been. But I think that my inclination is I live with two people that like to perform witch rituals and make potions sometimes on Saturday nights.
I'm all for that.
And I find that to be a lot.
Did you ever play witches as a kid?
No.
You didn't make potions?
No.
What? What imaginary games
did you
play?
have a healer streak. This is shocking I'm ashamed to admit this. I was not a marriage or witch or any of those. I wasn't a Barbie girl. I was actually a baby born girl. I used to just carry around a baby and be mum, which is very confusing.
It's the last thing I expected you to say.
People genuinely must walk like I think a lot of people think I'll never have children. I don't have like a maternal inclination like in that way to have my own children. As a little baby, I carried baby borns around like strapped to my chest.
You're not worried about motherhood because you've lived it.
I've been a mother to so many of those baby borns.
Oh my
so
God.
as a small child, no, it was more mothering stuff rather than witches or marriage or anything.
I was making some like hectic potions. I was like quite intense with it. And then if I wasn't playing witches, I was playing weird children that have been abandoned. Like we've like been shipwrecked
on the island. I do
Yes.
that too. That's what I did.
Shipwrecked on the island.
Like how would we as a group respond? That's
yes,
how I would do.
And I'd always play the big sister.
You would play the big
Okay.
sister.
Anyway.
I love these detours we're doing. These side quests are important to me.
The point I was saying, also my family has a witchy inclination. Like
Okay.
my great-grandmother was room full of crystals, Reiki healer. When I was a kid, and I was like, I have a big decision to make in primary school, my nan would make me hold a crystal and be like, now if your body naturally rocks forward, that's a yes. And if it naturally... And I thought this was normal.
That's really funny, Sarah. This is
So
great.
when I was reading about this egg white thing, I was like, oh yeah, I've done that, done the old cleanse. Anyway, it was somewhat believed that these girls did it because Tituba had taught them how to do it. And the accounts vary, but it seems that they were like friends with Tituba to some extent. She would sort of tell them folklore stories about where she was from as well.
I know how this is going to end, and I'm not happy.
And I also want to say on this, like talking about witchy inclinations and like that folklore magic, is I have read a few times that people would never admit to it or perform it publicly, but folk magic was still practiced in private by many people. Like examples that I found, and ironically, people would use the Bible to test for witchcraft. They would balance it on a person's head, using it to like weigh guilt. And then they'd ask a question and open the book at a random page to look for a sign in the passage.
I do tarot cards. Does that count? Like I
It's
feel like
giving that a little bit.
I get that. Like the card will tell me what's going to happen.
Well, a sign, you know, small handmade figures. I'm sounding like voodoo dolls, right? Or like voodoo dolls were used to like protect or harm others, depending on like who was using them and why. There was a belief a lot of the time, especially like in Europe and stuff, of the evil eye as well. Like someone could harm you just by looking at you with enough envy. However, on one of the occasions that the girls were doing this with the egg whites, they became freaked out when the shape that it formed was the shape of a coffin. And again, I just want to say, like,
That's
to
a
the
pretty
modern
random-
ear, you'd be like, and whatever. But reminder, like, these girls are being raised in the strictest of strict Puritan households with like God-fearing households. So it would be terrifying to see like death. You'd be like, oh, the devil is here, almost definitely.
in the room with us. Then, not long after the ritual, Betty and Abigail began to act strangely. Really strange. They had fits and convulsions, screamed and cried out for no reason, crawled under furniture or stared into corners. Me after a bad day at work. that's actually
is what
so
happened.
inappropriate, sorry. Claimed to feel like they were being pricked or pinched, said invisible spirits were attacking them. Again,
it's like kind of funny we were just talking about imaginary games because it's like, do you think this is one that got out of hand?
Like, how did this, did they really believe it? Is this attention seeking? Like, it raises so many questions as to how this has occurred. Like, is it real?
Why? It's so funny when you think, because remember, we're talking about children here. Do you remember there would always be one child in primary school that like felt the need to lie or felt the need to just...
There was a girl in my grade in year 2.
Call her out.
Her name's Danny.
All right.
Did not like her one bit. She always used to cry every day and she got an award when she didn't cry. And I thought, I'm getting A's. Why aren't I getting fucking awards? I was pissed. She came to school and this was an injustice to me. I went to the teacher and I said, tell her to stop lying. Every day there was a new lie. And one of the ones that set me off the most that I cannot forget is she said that Jessie McCartney, like beautiful soul Jessie McCartney, came to her house the night before and kissed her.
I love Danny. I would have been friends.
And I was sick of it.
Wait, that's so funny.
And there's always a child that tells the lie because it's compelling. And like for news, they'd get up and tell a blatant lie about a celebrity. And it would piss me off to no end. I have to come up with something that actually happened on the weekend at netball. And you get to go up and say you met, you met Justin Bieber and you were the one less lonely girl. I can't stand it. I'm not a liar.
And this is why you would have burned at the stake. But also, that's what I was thinking when I was reading this. Like, I feel like when I'd heard about the Salem witch trials, I think because maybe the play, The Crucible, was always played in high school, I assumed they were all like 18-year-old girls doing this. The fact these are like 8-year-olds, I'm like, okay. And obviously, Reverend Paris was like, what the fuck is going on? And called a doctor. But of course, with like no logical explanation or a physical reasoning, it's the devil's fault.
And they're not going to come out at that point and go, jokes. Jokes, it was all sorry.
No, and then once someone starts like throwing devil around, maybe you are a terrified kid probably by this stage, you're like, oh, well, I guess we're going to run with this. The doctor then pretty much gave his analysis, which is the devil must be overtaking their soul and acting through them, meaning witchcraft. And that's where it all began.
Maybe they really were witches and they were having fits and convulsions, but it seems just more like two great actresses of their time. It's very hard to do this and like give it the gravity and also go, what were these dedicated theatre kids?
So then Reverend Paris, of course, asked the girls, like, who did this? And they just start pointing fingers, right? Because they're terrified. And obviously they named Tituba. They also named 2 other women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne.
Oh, you would have been lined up too. In your notes, you've written, fuck off.
Fuck off.
I'm looking at Sarah's notes. What's with the Sarahs? Fuck off. Tell me, who are these Sarahs, please?
They were easy targets.
Oh, just like you, apparently.
No, not I. So Sarah Osborne was in her late 40s. She had once been respectable and married to a well-off man, but after he died, she sort of shocked the community by marrying her Irish indentured servant and was fighting to keep control of her late husband's land, despite the fact she had sons. Conservatives, not loving that. Sarah Good, on the other hand, was in her late 30s and she was homeless. And her father died. His estate was tied up in legal disputes and she ended up marrying a man who couldn't support her.
Oh, you can see Abigail and Betty are actually strategists.
And I don't know how they did that off the top of their heads then.
But you can also imagine a world where they give a list of names and the people overseeing this pick the most vulnerable two.
Yeah.
Are selective in who they choose to persecute for this.
And again, there's only so much we know on this. But yeah, they were 2 pretty obvious choices because they were all unprotected and non-traditional. Now, Tituba put the accusation on its head. We will talk more about her, probably more in the second part when we get to the trials properly. But in court, in February of 1692, she didn't panic and like proclaim her innocence and accuse the girls of lying. She was actually really smart about it and was not really hindered by the belief in original sin. So Tituba confesses. She goes, yep, I did it. The girls are right. And she claimed that she had been forced by the devil to sign a book and serve him. And her confession was just filled with some crazy details. Like, she was like, some of her details included flying on a broomstick to see other witches in the village. She gave us a story and the court ate it up. She knew they would.
If you knew you were going to do it, if you knew you were gone anyway.
I think she just like really weighed that up and was like,
maybe
okay.
she is a witch. Good on her.
Like, she probably was practicing like, do we believe the devil appeared and she signed a book? Like, probably not.
Imagine that.
But it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Like, her confession made people believe that witches must be everywhere. They were hiding in plain sight. And now the ball was rolling. other afflicted girls came forward, claiming to be possessed by the devil. Notably, Anne Putman, who was only 12 years old, and she was very outspoken. There was also Mary Walcott, who was 17, Mercy Lewis. She was also a servant in the house of the Putnams. And there's also Elizabeth Hubbard, who was 18, who was a servant in the house of the doctor who had first diagnosed Betty and Abigail. And then also another girl called Susanna Sheldon, who was 15. And all of them just started accusing countless other people of witchcraft in Salem. But I want to look at, like, why would the girls act afflicted or just start accusing people?
Well, this is the big question, right? Like, there are hundreds of potential reasonings to this, but I think there are a few that are the most fascinating. The first is just attention, obviously. One of the interesting points in the BBC documentary about this was that for servant girls or poorer girls, this was now a way to suddenly receive a lot of attention where you otherwise would not have. The original influence.
Story time. Sorry.
Who did I marry?
Okay.
Sorry. I guess to go from being, considered a poor person or a servant, and suddenly you have the headlines, you have the moment, you have the audience.
The whole town is looking to you.
You can completely set yourself aside from the crowd. In that climate, that is the biggest thing in the world.
But also, these people are very religious, and the reverend is taking special attention in you.
Yeah.
And adults are taking you seriously. These are all kids. I mean, eldest being like 18, but still, you're young.
Yeah.
And adults are listening to you as the be-all and end-all.
Yes. Then the next potential reason is also very childlike, but it's social contagion. They might have genuinely psychologically believed it, born out of genuine stress or fear. Genuinely just a scared child acting out. The third is power trip. And this is more cynical, and it's more likely speaking to the adults who got involved in the witch trials and mass hysteria. But accusing someone of being a witch was also power. Again, women were suddenly centre stage and feared in a place and a system that otherwise expected obedience and submission. Be a good wife.
I think that's such an interesting part of this as well, of why women leaned into this, is because, like, they're in a society that would have not given them a voice at all.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're a little feared.
And it could be that your marriage ended and you are trying to win something back from your husband, and like society already sees you as damaged, stained, broken. Or you're a servant or a slave, basically, and your life is fucking horrendous already. And suddenly there's the opportunity to escape that in any capacity and be feared suddenly rather than treated like shit.
Or even just the ability that women were accusing other women. Like, a lot of this, like, I think those initial examples of why this would have happened would have been if you're acting afflicted. But I think the accusations were really the power trip.
Yes. Then there's strategy. For some people, this is a business opportunity. It's said that some accusations were likely encouraged or planned by influential families who had rivalries within their community. So, for example, the Putnams. Anne's family had a history of land disputes and political grudges. Many of the people Anne Putnam Jr. accused were either in conflict with her family, she's 12, competing for land, or on the opposing side of village politics.
But isn't that interesting that they would have then put their daughter forward as strategy?
Yeah. It's really scary.
A lot of people will say that, like, this was all feuds with your neighbours.
Yeah. The old build a fence and it shades my tree or some shit, If your enemies are suddenly witches, you didn't just win a court case, you wiped them off the map entirely. And this meant that any widowed women who had inherited land because their partner or parents died and they were somehow now independent were targeted. Land equals power. I mean, it still does, but it did more so than ever. This is the primary investment or wealth opportunity. So women owning land was not ideal. And if they were accused and executed, back up for grabs immediately. A good example of this in Salem was, yes, Sarah Osborne, who we already mentioned, but also a woman named Bridget Bishop, who was twice widowed and owned property and ran a tavern, which was incredibly rare for a woman. She's outspoken, she's independent, and she's sexually suggestive by the Puritan standards.
Yeah, I couldn't find too much in it except that, like, what she wore was like, it was like she was bright, she dressed like loud.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a threat. She was the first person executed during these trials.
Yeah, and you wonder why. I think the other one as well was self-protection because, I mean, obviously this all got out of hand really fast, these accusations, because one of the best ways of getting out of an accusation if you didn't want to confess was to point the finger at somebody else and to pass the blame. And that's why so many marginalized people took the fall, because, you know, similar to Sarah, they weren't going to be defended. They were going to become the scapegoat.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so when the trials reached full speed, also then not accusing someone could make people wonder if you were hiding something. So people also started to do it so that, like, you contributed, you made a bit of noise, and people weren't going to look to you.
Yeah.
Because it was suspicious to say nothing.
Diverting attention, distracting.
And the irony being of, like, a deep-rooted fear of lying, those who survived the witchcraft accusations were the ones that lied the most.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get to, we'll get to it more in the second part, I'm sure, as well. But, like, how do we compare this to modern day?
I mean, I don't think we have to look too far to see how the media, and we talk about this a lot, how they work to blame an individual or a vulnerable group and target them and finger wag and finger point to distract from the fact that it's usually the most elite who are trying to conceal something and make sure the population doesn't rise up against them. And that is what's happening here. When we're looking at the social contagion, the attention, the power, and what it could mean if you were able to execute someone, it's really just making sure that the wealthy continue to hoard and grow and evolve, and they can distract by placing burden, responsibility, blame, and media attention on vulnerable people at any cost.
And I think that's what religion at this time was very much used to do, because I think logic is nowhere to be found when people are scared. And when people are scared, they're going to look for someone to blame. And we see that throughout history because it is human nature. And I think even if it started quite earnestly with Abigail and Betty, what it turned into, as it always does with human nature, was this ability to exercise and enforce fear, you know, in a town that was leaning back towards, like, oh, we're going to let more people in, and it's maybe straying from conservatism a little bit. This was the prime way to get everyone back to conservative times, because the devil is mad at you and it's these people's fault. That was the ultimate power trip I think we see all the time, and especially in this, which was that fear from everyone was used against them. Also, I think it's worth linking it as well to cancel culture.
I think that's quite interesting, actually. But, it comes from both sides too. Like, it's not just what we're talking about, the far right using media and power. Like, this happens to women on the left, and people from all sides get involved too regularly. It is this targeting and this constant, like, degrading of a woman who is women are always seen as calculated strategists manipulating something.
Yeah.
When they just might be making a decision for themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Like, women's agency is seen as such a threat to a system of patriarchy that this is still deeply embedded in our culture, and just in different expressions.
Oh, yeah. I also think cancel culture, like, it's often referred to as the modern day witch hunt. I mean, with social media, like, a well-placed accusation, even if it wasn't founded in proof necessarily, was enough to ruin someone's identity overnight online.
Yes, but then we also see it weaponized by men who have been accused in the Me Too movement, saying, like, it's a witch hunt and I've been put on trial and I'm sort of already guilty. And no, this is a culture that's saying, oh, well, sexual harassment is now being taken seriously, and this isn't a witch hunt. There are multiple people who are making valid, credible accusations against you that you need to answer to.
Oh, absolutely. But I also think, like even just looking at, like, an influencer sense on it, or like a celebrity sense, like an internet troll who would have otherwise maybe not have been listened to is now able to throw out a comment or an accusation or whatever it is, and that can blow up and get all this attention and validation. Like, and it didn't really need to come from much. And, like, similar, I guess, in the way that an accusation alone, even if not proven otherwise, just like the trials, is enough. Like, the modern day witch hunt could be perceived as, like, the Taylor Swift is over party, or, like, what's happening to Blake Lively or Amber Heard, whatever it was online.
Yeah, and they weren't burnt at the stake or tortured or executed, but the way in which a mob mentality was able to completely flatten their career, their identity, the way that people are willing to get on board. What we're really talking about is that collective mentality, and how often toxicity is more powerful than positivity in that sense. Yeah.
And also just the whole public spectacle of it is similar to the trials and everything.
People want to watch a downfall.
But I think that's where we should leave it today, because in the next part, I would like to get into the trials, but also the pop culture resurgence, and a little bit more of the global impact as well. Thank you so much for listening to Big Talk this week, and we will see you next Wednesday for part 2. And we'll see you tomorrow for Small Talk, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
See you next Tuesday.